Hi, this is Christoph, and this is episode number 6 of the Redis and Laravel series. And in this episode, we're going to create a Twitter newsfeed. As you see on my screen here, we have an example. We've got a few users, and I'm on user number 1's feed. And if I go to post update, as user number 1, I can post, I am recording. And then I go back to my newsfeed, and you'll see that it posted to my newsfeed. And anybody following me will also get this message. Let me take you in the routes.php just to show you what I've got going on here. As you see with all these routes, I actually have an ID in front of everything. That's why, as you see here, we have 1/feed. And then if I go to 2/feed, you'll have a different user, and then 3-feed, again you have another user. The reason I did this is because I didn't want to focus on creating user accounts and having authentication and that sort of thing, even though you could entirely do this in Redis. You could store the passwords, password hashes, this sort of thing, just have entire user models in Redis and use authentication that way. But instead of spending time on that, I just went ahead and I did IDs before every route. That way I know who's doing what, and I can store things accordingly. So keep that in mind as we move forward. This is not the best way of doing it, at least not for user authentication, so you'd probably want to change this in your application. All right, so the first thing I want to take a look at is the post update routes. We have a get and a post. The get is just going to show you the screen to add an update, and then the post is going to actually process this update. And so if we go in our user controller and we look at show add update, we're just returning the view user.update, and this is what is going to display when I go to post update here. We literally just have an input field. I think it allows about 50 characters or so, and then we just have this is just a form. And let me show you what happens when you click on that add button and we do a do add update function here. Again, I'm passing in the ID. This is just the ID of the user. Normally you do an authentication in your model here, or not in this controller here, but in the model itself, and to determine who's processing this request. But as you see here, I'm just taking the update input, and then I'm validating this in my update registrar, and then as the validation passes, I'm creating it again in the update registrar. So let's take a look at this create function, because that's where the magic with Redis starts happening. If I open my services and I go in my update registrar, which by the way I am injecting in here, as you can see. So if I go inside of it, there's my validator function, but let's take a look at the create function. I am taking in an array of data and the ID of the user, and then I'm just returning update with a static call to the function create, and again passing in the update data and the user ID. So where is this update? Well, this is our model update.php, and it's just implementing update contract. I'm passing it in as a dependency injection, as you saw earlier, just like the post registrar. And this method that we were looking at, the static function, is called create. This time we're just taking in the data because we are passing in the user ID and the update information in just one in just one array called or stored in the variable data. And what we're doing in this function is actually quite basic. Let's just walk through it step by step. The first thing I'm doing is I'm accessing Redis and incrementing a key called next post ID. In a relational database situation, this is going to be the primary key, right? You can never have duplicate keys. They have to be unique. We can mimic this with Redis by incrementing next post ID. That way we never have the same ID, even if two users access it at the same time. This method here is atomic, which means it will always be unique. Next thing here, I'm just getting the current time. This is going to be the Unix time, and we'll store this as we post our update. That way we know when it was posted. And then what I'm doing here is I'm actually creating the message. How am I doing this? I'm taking a hash, and that's where I'm going to post my update inside of. Hashes are really good to use when you want to represent an object. So in this case, we're using it for posts. We can also use it for users, right? With a username, with a password, with a date registered. In this case, we're doing, we're having a key of post and then the ID of the post. That way we know it's unique. And this again was generated here. And then we're passing in fields and values. The first field is user ID, and that's just so we know who posted it. Then we have the time, which we generated up here, and then the text is going to be the actual update text that we posted. Once this is successful with this, which we check with this if function right here, then what I want to do is I want to push this update to everyone following me. Okay, so this is actually accomplished by calling another static function, which I have down here, and I'm passing in this post ID and the user ID as well. And we'll see why in a minute as we scroll down here. So the first thing I'm doing in this push update function is I'm getting a list of followers for this user ID. So that's why I passed in the user ID, because I want to check and see, okay, who all is following this user, and we're going to store it in an array here. And then what we're going to do is we're actually going to add the author himself or herself in this array, because we basically want the author to receive their own post as well. So we're acting like they're subscribed to their own posts. And then we just have a basic for each loop for every single follower. We want to push it with an L push to posts and follower ID. So all these posts here are going to be, they're going to have a colon here, and they're going to be followed by the unique user ID, so that way we can pull it back. Okay, and once that's successful, we want to return true. So let me show you, we just posted a message here, and let me try to remember what the ID of the user was. I think it's 1, and let's see, Newsfeed. Okay, so user Christoph here just posted I am recording, and his user ID is 1. And so if we look at, let's take a look at, where is it? Followers and then user ID, because we're using user ID here. So since it's a Z range, we know it's a sorted set, as we previously talked about in previous episodes. So let me go in my Redis command line on our server, and let me pull that up. Let me do a Z range followers 1, because as you remember, Christoph is user 1, and I'm going to return all indexes. And as you see, we have user ID number 3 and number 2 following me, or following Christoph. And so that's why, or that's what's going to be returned in this followers array here when we do this check. And then I'm adding myself as well, so we're going to add ID number 1, and then we're going to do an L push, as I said previously. So let's check that by doing L range posts 3, again return all indexes. And as you see, well, the post number 8 I know because I've been working with this, but post number 8 is going to be this new post we just created here, I am recording. And we can check again with posts 2, and as you see, post number 8 is there as well. There's also post number 7, post number 6. That means that this user probably is going to have 3 posts on their newsfeed, and we can check that by doing, or going to route to/feed, and as you see, there are 3 there. So that's the 3 right there. So every time that we're going to post a post or an update, if you will, we're going to push it to every single range, or list. This is list here, L range, this is list. So every time we push an update, we're going to push it to all the followers' lists. They have their personal lists, and that way we know what to show in their feed. And this is exactly what we're doing in this function right here, and we're returning the result here. So as this push update is successful, as it returns true, then we want to return the post ID back to the controller. And this logic down here is just in case it fails. This is pretty bad error handling, honestly, for a real world case. You'd probably want to put this in a queue and try again, but I just deleted and decremented the ID. It made it easier for me to debug and that sort of thing. So let's go back to the controller, and remember this returns post ID here, and it was user controller and do add update. So as we get a result, this is what we just looked at here. As we get the result, we're just going to return the view user.newsfeed with message update successfully posted. And if you remember, when I posted my update, we did see this message. If not, then just say update did not post, please try again later. And since I was just on the topic of talking about lists and pushing all those updates to each individual user's lists, let's take a look at the routes and see which route handles that. And it's going to be the route feed, which is UserController.php. It's just in the same controller we just looked at, except it's going to be a different function, which is down here, show feed. Again, we're passing in the user ID just so we know who we're dealing with. And what we're doing in this function is, first of all, we're going to trim the list of posts, because we don't want to have, I mean, if we had like a real Twitter situation here and we had a bunch of posts, we wouldn't want to post or store posts that are really, really old. So, I mean, in this example, I'm just doing 100. I'm sure Twitter has a bigger limit than that, but you could do 1,000 if you want to do whatever you want. But what's important to remember here is that ltrim is just going to trim this list. So it doesn't matter how many we currently have in there, we want to just have 100, so anything past 100 is going to get trimmed out, okay? If we look at the next few lines here, the first thing we want to do when showing our feed is to get the post IDs for that user. So that's what we just looked at earlier. If we go back to the command line, when we did lrange post 0, -1 for all indexes, and we get these 3 post IDs here, that's exactly what we're doing with this line right here. We're returning a max of 100, which makes sense since we trimmed to 100. You can change this to whatever you want. This just says index 0 to index 100. And then the next line is calling the function getPosts on update, our model update that we injected in this controller here. So let's take a look at that. And if we go to getPosts, okay, so as the description says, we get updates associated with specified post IDs, and we're passing in the post IDs here as we just showed. This is passed in here, which is calculated with our lrange function there. So as you remember, with user ID 2, we get 3 IDs. So we have our array that we're passing in here. And I'm just initializing an empty array right here and doing a loop with my post IDs. And the first thing I want to do is I want to get all the fields and values in the hash for the posts. I want to get all the information stored in our post hash. And let's take a look. So if we do hgetAll post and then post ID, we're going to get the result and store it in this array here. But let's take a look in the command line. And if we do post 8, this is post number 8 that I was just looking at. We see that it's returning the fields and the values. So the field user ID has a value of 1. That means user 1 or user with ID 1 posted it. The time, this is our Unix time we calculated when we posted it. And the text is I am recording. Okay, so as I said, these hashes are a good way to represent objects because we can have these fields and values that really help out. All right, so we stored this result in here, this variable here. And then since we have the user ID, we really want to get the user name. I mean, the ID is not very helpful for humans. It's good for the computer, but for humans, we want to return the actual name of the person. So what I'm doing is I'm going to look up, again, a hash for user and then the user ID, and then look for the username itself. So hget, and we do user, it's user1, and we're going to look for the username, and it's going to return Christoph. Okay, so actually, before recording this, I manually inputted the users in here. In your application, you would have Redis and Logic work together to create these hashes with users, username, password, as I mentioned earlier. So I mainly put in a few users, and I've got Christoph here for user 1, and if I did user 2, I think we'd get another user called Paul, etc. Okay. So once we have this username, we're going to append it to the array so we can access it later, because here we return the array, the complete array, which is going to be used in our controller to pass it into the view user newsfeed, and it's going to pass in the posts there. So let's take a look at this view user newsfeed so we understand a little bit more what's going on. And it's going to be here, user.newsfeed. So I'm using the blade syntax in here, nothing special. In this first logic block, I'm just checking to see if there's a message, like an error message or something like that. If not, or even if there is, we're going to proceed with this block here. And in this block, we're just going to have a for each loop. So for every single post that we calculated in here, we're going to keep looping and posting out the text. So in our case, the text is here. I am recording. So that's what's happening here. And then post it on time date. I'm actually taking the Unix time date that we had and transforming it in a human readable format. And then by username, if you remember, we appended that to the array, and I'm just capitalizing the first letter of the person's name. So very basic. Next, let's take a look at the following system. And first of all, let's go to the user list route, which is ID user list. And it's going to call show user list, which we were just looking at right here. So let's do show user list. Whoops. No, that's the name of it's just user list. That was the name of the function, not the route. All right, so what's going on in here? And if you note, this is listing all of our users except for the user itself, right? We don't want to show the user himself or herself. So if I do that, since Christoph is ID number 1, he doesn't pop up there. So this is actually pretty simple as well. I'm hiding a lot of secrets here, but we'll dive into this in just a second. But the first thing I'm doing is I've got feed user up right here that I'm calling a static method on. And if I go up here just to show you, this is how I'm calling or adding feed user to this controller. And so let's take a look at app directory and then user feed, which is, let me close all this out. So here's feed user. And here's the function get user list. Okay, so let's go back here just for a second. Let's take a look. All right, so feed user, get user list, we're passing in ID and a number, in this case 10. The first number is the user ID himself or herself, and then this number is the limit of how many users we want to display at one time. So we have flexibility in this case. All right, so we're doing an L range starting at index 0 up to this maximum number, and let's do that right now in our command line. L range users 0 to all the indexes, and this is going to be a list of all users. Again, I manually inputted this before this screencast, but this is a good way of keeping track of all the users that we have in our application. You could also use a different data type. I'm using a list here because it just worked fine for what I'm doing here, but check out the Redis documentation if you want to learn more about the pros and cons of using lists. All right, so if we don't have an empty user list, then we're going to initialize an empty array and loop over this list of users. So in this case, we're going to loop over 4 different users, IDs 1 through 4. And I'm just doing a little bit of filtering here so I can filter out, because when I return this, as we see here, we get user : 1, 2, 3, 4. But what if we want just the ID? Well, in that case, we just do a string replace, which is a PHP function that's going to take the user : replace it with nothing, and then do that or apply this filter on our value, which is the whole string user : 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Okay, so now we just have that filtered ID, and we check to see if our filtered ID is equal to the current ID or current user's ID. If it is, then we don't pass it into the array, because as I said earlier, we don't want to be able to follow ourselves. We should already be doing that. Okay, so inside of here, I'm just again doing the user or getting the username of each individual user, capitalizing the first letter, and then I'm also adding in the ID, which will be useful in just a minute when we look at our view. Okay, so then I'm just going to return this array back to our controller. and that's what I'm storing in users, and then that's what I'm passing in users here, and then current user ID. So let's take a look at user list. Whoops, where is it? User. Okay, so here it is. Again, I'm just checking for error messages or anything of that nature, and I'm making sure user is set and it's not empty, and then I loop over them. I'm just going to display the username and then the URL with the IDs and the ability to click to follow, and that's what we see here. So if I want to follow Paul or Joel, I can just click on follow, and it will go through all that logic that we have right here. So this is our other route, and that's calling the function follow user. And just to prove that to you, if you see current user ID /follow /user ID, we go in our routes. You see ID /follow /user ID is calling UserController@follow user. Okay, so follow user, again, we're passing in the current user's ID and the ID of the user to follow, right? Which we have, or we added here. This is the ID of the user we want to follow. This is our current user's ID. This would be easier, as I said, if you had a current or a correct user authentication system. You wouldn't get so confused trying to decide which ID is which. That got me a few times while I was working on this, but that's my own fault for not going through with a complete authentication system. Okay, but anyway, so again, I'm calling feed user, and we're passing in the ID and user ID to follow user. Let's take a look at that again. Okay, so follow user is down here. We're receiving the current user ID and the follow user ID, and all we're doing, very simple, 2 lines of code. We're adding the follower ID, user ID. I'm sorry, we're adding in the current user ID to the followers list for the following user ID. Okay, so that can be a little bit confusing, but every time we're going to follow a user, we're going to add our ID to their lists of followers. Okay, so I follow someone, I'm going to add my ID to their list of followers, and then I'm going to add their ID to my list of following. So let's take a look at that. And let me just clear this, pull up all the keys. And as you see, we have a few here. So let's do zrange followers for user 1 and list all of them. So user number 1, or with ID 1, has 2 followers, user 3 and user 2. Let's see how many people he or she is following by doing zrange following 1, 0, -1. Funny enough, they're actually following each other. And it looks like I've got all of them following each other anyway, so that's not going to be a good example, but and hopefully you're following my logic, but just in case you're not, leave me a comment below and I'll explain it a little bit better. Alright, so that's what's going on here, and then again, this is just the opposite. Okay, and then we're just returning true for that. Alright, and as you may notice, this is, if we go back to the user list, I'm already following Paul. I think I'm also following Joel, but they're still showing us follow. So in a real application, we'd really want to check and have logic to make sure that we're not already following them. And if we are following them, then instead of saying follow, it would say unfollow and give us that ability. So that's one thing to keep in mind as you build your application. I try to keep this as simple as possible, otherwise it would have taken me a lot longer to come out with this episode. But there's so much you can do with this. There's an incredible amount, and it just goes to show you again that Redis is really powerful, and we did all of this without creating a bunch of tables and having relationships and all that stuff. All of this is stored in memory. Super fast to access, super fast to write and read. So again, this shows you the power, but you may also notice that there's a lot of redundancy. We're storing a lot of the same things just in different ways, and that's okay. That's perfectly fine. That's just the way that we have to do it in Redis. Otherwise, we don't have any way of accessing the information. And for people coming from a relational database background, that's going to be a hard thing to wrap your head around. I know, because that's my experience as well. At first, I just did not want to have that redundancy, but then I did more reading, more research, and it's just the way it works in Redis, and that's perfectly fine. It's still more efficient than having something like relational database. So hopefully this shows you the power of Redis and how you can use it. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and learned a lot from it. Hopefully I didn't go over it too fast. I know this is a lot of material, but it is building on previous episodes as well. So if you're confused on some of these, like the sorted sets and just the regular sets and that sort of thing, you want to look at more data types, take a look at the previous episodes. And there are also a few more episodes coming out in the next week or two. So subscribe. If you have any questions, send me an email or a message through the website or through YouTube. And thanks a lot for watching.